I'm scrolling to death. I'm super excited today to talk to Brooke Natzke, who is a mom and former educator at the Waldorf school here in Southern California, near where I live. So, hi, Brooke. Thank you for joining me.
Hi, Nikki. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So, I am very interested, as we've spoken about before, in the way schools integrate technology in today's society. It became kind of something I've been paying more attention to now that my children, my older children, are in first and second grade, and they're relying a lot on technology in their classrooms. And for many of us parents, it seems to be that the only option is our public school system, which is becoming nearly all tech-based learning.
hmm
Starting in kindergarten or sometimes preschool, kids are given a tablet or an iPad to do games or activities that we're being told are educational. So, to give you a little bit more backstory, when I first started researching for this podcast, I kept hearing and reading something that intrigued me, and it was that tech executives, some of them that work for these social media companies that make our educational tech or social media platforms, often send their children to lower tech private schools. And one of them that kept coming up in my reading was the Waldorf school system. So that got me diving in to figure out, like, what is Waldorf? How is it different from public schools? Um, why would these tech executives specifically who restrict technology that they make from their own children, that's a whole rabbit hole in itself. But I wanted to start by asking you, as a former Waldorf educator who also put your kids through Waldorf schooling, can you tell listeners about the Waldorf approach to education?
Yeah, it's a great question, and there are so many different entry points. But I'll harken back to the origin story of
Okay.
Waldorf education because I think the impetus behind the education really explains a lot behind the practices that we and the methodology.
Mm-hmm.
So Rudolf Steiner is is the founder of the Waldorf educational philosophy, and he was a philosopher at the beginning or the turn of the 20th century. And he had been talking a lot about lots of different topics: agriculture, government, social structures, things like that. And right at World War One, there was just this real question about, is this structure of society working for us? And how do you explain this level of kind of inhumanity throughout World War One? And so at that time, he had somebody who had been attending his lectures asking him about opening a school for his factory workers' children. And Steiner, of course, had been thinking about all kinds of different thoughts. And once he was asked this thought, he said, "Yeah, great. I have this idea about an education that would allow humanity to kind of exist in its wholeness.
Mm-hmm.
And what would it look like to educate students in a way that would be thoughtful for kind of the existence of humanity? How can we implement education in a way that allows people to freely think and freely develop new concepts and new ideas for a world that we don't know what it's going to look like in the future?"
Mm-hmm.
So that impulse, I think, says a lot about what happened in the first Waldorf school and has subsequently happened. So there was this real strong pedagogical impulse to
Mm-hmm.
develop free thinking and to develop a new way of approaching the world. And there was this social impulse.
Mm-hmm.
And the social impulse was, how do we get along together? How do we construct a world where kind of the sanctity of life is really at the center?
Mm-hmm.
So all of Waldorf pedagogy centers around this understanding of human development, and that there are natural phases in our development, archetypal phases that have existed all through human history. And when is the right time to introduce a new topic? What is right for a certain phase of childhood? And that's something that you'll really see in a Waldorf education, are these real strong developmental phases where it's not if we're going to introduce something, but when is it optimal?
Mm-hmm.
And so in early childhood, that's very, very clear because there's a strong sense that, up till the age of 7, all of those early childhood years, children learn best through imitation, through play, hands-on activity, seeing meaningful work in their immediate environment in order to imitate that. A young child is highly imitative. I'm sure you've had that experience. I love just even the baby experience where you do peekaboo,
Mm-hmm.
and before they really know what they're doing, they're copying you. And
Yeah.
so that's the origin story. And then in a practical sense, what that looks like throughout the grades and up higher is there are curriculum content that really speaks to maybe an inner experience that the child is going through. One example is at around age 9, that real strong imitation or that feeling like you're a part of the whole starts to shift. And a child goes through this developmental phase, which we call the 9-year change, where they're starting to notice they're actually not so connected to the world. They're starting to notice differences. As a teacher, often they see that I have a mole on my arm that they didn't see before, or they notice that maybe I pronounce a word funny in a funny way, or maybe that my singing voice isn't always in tune. You know, they'll start noticing these differences that they didn't notice before. And that really is indicating this differentiation, an internal differentiation where they feel super connected with the world. And now they're kind of stepping back and being more of an observer and seeing that not everything is connected.
Okay. Amazing. So first of all, this is the second time this week I've heard the word pedagogical, and that is not a word I had heard before. And so I wonder if there might be listeners who don't know what that means. So can you describe that word, please?
Yeah, so pedagogical is anything relating to methods to teaching and learning.
Okay.
So that can be how you approach presenting curriculum. It can be curriculum itself, but it can also be your approach to curriculum.
Okay, great. And what would you say are a couple of the biggest differences in what the school day looks like for students at a Waldorf school versus like a public school? And I know you sent your kids to Waldorf, so maybe you don't know exactly what it looks like in a public school, but what comes up for you?
Well, I mean, I definitely grew up in a public school system.
Right,
that was my own experience growing up. So the education that my kids have experienced is quite different than my own. I think the first thing that you would notice from the outside is just the structure of our school day. So my experience growing up is I had one class after another. And every day I would have reading, every day I would have math, every day I would have geography, for example, or social studies, I guess would be something. And our school day starts with what's called a main lesson. So it's a 2-hour block of time that you spend with the class teacher. And that's a real strong component of our grades curriculum is the class teacher often stays with the same group of children for 8 years. So that in and of itself is going to be totally different. That relationship with your teacher is huge. And then the structure of the school day, that first 2 hours of the day is studying one subject intently for 3 to 4, 5 weeks. In first grade, that pretty much alternates back and forth between language arts and math. And in that 2-hour time period, there's a part at the beginning of the lesson, which we call the rhythmic part of the lesson, where we're basically just priming the body to get ready for the day. So that includes different types of movements, both gross and fine motor movements. It can be singing, reciting different verses, playing a musical instrument, practicing different skills like skip counting or counting forward and backward. And essentially, it's the warm-up of that 2-hour lesson. Very therapeutic in its capacity to start integrating your neural pathways, also integrating your senses, making sure that you're really in your body in a way that you're kind of the rider of the horse instead of the horse riding you. And then from there, our curriculum is really presented orally, verbally. So the teacher in the lower grades is telling a story to present the curriculum content. And the reason why that's important is it creates these real strong mental pictures. It's almost as if you're putting into the minds of these young children, you're getting them to really just imagine what the story content. I hate to say that movie in your head because it's more, right? Because when you dream and you think about those real strong pictures, it's multi-sensory. It's not just a picture, but there's like a body sensation that happens with that too. What we're trying to do is create these really vivid imaginations, these vivid pictures that relate to a child's feeling life. They have some type of feeling connection to the information that they're learning.
Mm-hmm.
And what we know in the history of Waldorf education, but even in educational research, is that when a child can connect at a strong level to what they're learning, it sticks, it stays in their memory.
Mm-hmm.
So we present the curriculum in that way, and then there's also a portion of that lesson where they're actually doing work. And what that looks like in a Waldorf school is, rather than having a textbook where
Mm-hmm.
they're taking work from that textbook or reading, they are producing their own textbook by illustrating some imagery from the story, eventually writing their own stories, writing their own content.
Mm-hmm.
And by the end of the school year, they have an entire main lesson book, which is their textbook of their own work activity, their own will forces,
Yeah,
um, at the end of the year.
that's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
One thing I just want to get a little more detail on is so the aspect of the teacher staying with the class
Mm-hmm.
for 8 years. You know, you think of typically a teacher knows their subject, right, really well, and they're the
Yeah.
expert in that subject, and they teach the same thing over and over and over. So, how does the teacher stay with and grow with those students over 8 years and kind of understand all of these different subjects that the kids are learning?
Yeah. So the teacher embodies this idea of being a continual learner.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
A class teacher is a generalist. They are pulling in all kinds of information. And just to back up a little bit, Waldorf teachers have their own special Waldorf certifications. So there are Waldorf teacher training institutes and certificates for Waldorf training, which encompasses both the philosophy behind Waldorf education and just the
Mm-hmm.
methods of how we teach.
Okay.
Um, and then from year to year, you're spending your summers really preparing for all of the new content that's coming in the next year. One
Mm-hmm.
of the benefits of that is you're fresh. You're always fresh. So my experience in school is I had a fourth grade teacher who had been a fourth grade teacher for, it felt like millennia, like
Yeah.
she felt like she had
Yeah.
always been, like she was born a fourth grade teacher.
Right.
And she certainly knew her content very
Mm-hmm.
well, but there was also a level of it being stale. Like I imagine in my
Yeah.
head that she had a filing cabinet of worksheets, and month by month she pulled those out, and there
Mm-hmm.
wasn't a strong responsiveness to the kids that were in her class, or maybe
Mm-hmm.
their individual needs, um, or yeah, or even just the constellation of the class.
Mm-hmm.
What we find in Waldorf schools is, people come from all different parts of the world, and you get to weave together tales of their own heritage in a way that
Mm-hmm.
really connects with them. And
Yeah.
so that's one of the benefits of being a class teacher, and just being able to respond so specifically to this group of children that are in front of me. And
Amazing.
it is a lot of work.
Yeah.
It's absolutely a lot of work. Lots of reading, lots of research,
Yeah.
um, which, depending on your temperament, is, for me, was something that was absolutely exciting for me to do
Yeah.
that type
Well,
of learning.
it brings a new level of curiosity on behalf of the teacher because the teacher's
Yeah.
learning along with the students. Um, do the teachers have to, is it typically like a typical teacher where they have their bachelor's degree first and then they go to the Waldorf training, or is there not that requirement?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure state by state, those requirements are unique, but I'm pretty sure across the board, a bachelor's degree is required to work as a private school teacher.
Okay.
Definitely in the Waldorf, public Waldorf charter movement, there is a requirement to also have a teaching credential in the state of California
Mm,
anyway.
okay. Great.
So there's pros and cons to both of those systems. In an independent movement, it's easier to prioritize the Waldorf certificate because there's not the additional requirement of a credential program.
Mm,
In the public Waldorf movement, the credential is actually more important than the Waldorf certificate, and so sometimes those trainings can look reverse.
what do you mean by public Waldorf movement? Is that the state funded Waldorf schools?
Yes, that's right. So the Alliance for Public Waldorf Education is the association that accredits or is the membership body for any Waldorf schools that are using charter or public funds.
Okay. Okay, so listeners should know that there are private Waldorf schools and then there are state-funded public system Waldorf schools or schools that follow the Waldorf training, right?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. Okay, that's great. All right, let's shift to technology. So, what's the official approach to technology use at the Waldorf schools?
It's so funny to answer that question because it's in some ways we've been so behind the curve. For a long time, the Waldorf approach has been, screen free.
Right.
Early childhood, it's a huge educational moment for parents, and it's so countercultural. It has been so countercultural. That's shifting right now, it seems.
Mm-hmm.
But we really emphasize that the young child is best suited in a play-based environment where what they spend the majority of their time doing is in play, in imitation, in participating in in the household, in the way that the household
Mm-hmm.
has to function. So
Mm-hmm.
participating in chores, helping with cooking, that those activities and opportunities are what really develop those neural pathways that we rely on later for academic instruction.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Most Waldorf schools and the schools that I've been affiliated with, it's not this contractual agreement. We're not asking families to, sign this contract, but really there's this ongoing dialogue of asking parents just to make their own observations. What do you observe when your child spends a lot of time on a screen or in front of a television?
Mm-hmm.
And so helping parents kind of rest in their own uh, wisdom of knowing who their children are. And often parents share, yeah, my child's cranky. they don't want
Mm-hmm.
to, they don't want to let go of the device, or they don't,
Yeah.
they spend a half an hour after we turn it off just being upset. So
Yeah.
that's an ongoing dialogue. In our actual school system, we definitely are screen free, and have been for a long time. We don't utilize uh, computer technology. I mean, I think probably the highest advanced technology was like an overhead screen projector, and even that isn't used commonly. So the teacher really is developing their artistic skill, and we use just old-fashioned black chalkboards with lots of chalk drawings and illustrations. It looks very, a century ago, what most
Mm-hmm.
or all schools look like. And the idea behind that is, again, we're really trying to hone the students' own imaginative capacities, their own artistic skills, and teaching them how to learn in a way that is kind of step by step. So, an example would be, I would never give a child who's not learned how to walk yet a wheelchair
Mm-hmm.
to get from place A to place B. Like, it's
Right.
really, I mean, it might be easier, but what am I hampering by providing this, this technology or this device that they're
Yeah.
not going to be developing those other skills?
Right.
And over time, we also, the impulse behind Waldorf education is to be relevant to its time. So it doesn't make sense that children don't have any exposure to computers or to um, various other technologies, because that's just not the world that we live in. So
Mm-hmm.
again, it's not a question of if, but when.
Yeah.
And that's an ongoing question. And I think one thing that is great about Waldorf education or being an independent school is those questions about when
Mm-hmm.
are really in the hands of the teachers.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not a bureaucratic somebody sitting behind a desk in an office somewhere making kind of these top-down decisions, but really being a Waldorf teacher is like being a researcher. What am I experiencing in the classroom? If I try this, what's the outcome? How,
Mm-hmm.
and so being able to really take what you're learning from the kids to develop and respond to the curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't introduce any computers, we don't use tablets, we don't use any type of screen in the classroom until maybe 7th grade, and I'll speak just about the schools that I've been involved with.
Mm-hmm.
They're learning typing skills, they're learning maybe word processing skills, and then that might advance a little bit more in 8th grade. And then if there's a Waldorf high school, then that looks very much like a traditional high school setting. Their textbooks aren't on their computer. Again, we still are operating from this method of creating your own textbook, and
Mm-hmm.
but they definitely use computers for accessing grades, for accessing assignments,
Mm-hmm.
research, writing papers, etc.
Yeah. So interesting. I've done some research on what children absorb from digital textbooks versus actual paper textbooks. And so kids are retaining about 20% more from a paper textbook, but I wonder what it would look like, how much they're retaining when they create their own textbook. Like that would be interesting to know. And I'm sure there's
Right.
no study on that, but,
Yeah.
and then tell me about what is the class sizes at Waldorf?
So the schools that I have been involved with have had rather large class sizes. So I was involved with a charter school in Arizona, and
Mm-hmm.
so they, due to that public funding, had very large class sizes because it wasn't dependent on tuition income.
Mm-hmm.
and um, and then two different schools here in Southern California, but larger, more established schools with high schools.
Mm-hmm.
So the most recent school I've been working with, a full class is about 28 students.
Mm-hmm.
There is a range. The largest class I've had was 36 students, and that was from second grade through the end of fifth grade. And then
Wow.
during middle school, that shifted.
Mm-hmm.
One of the benefits of those really large classes in a Waldorf school is typically it's one class per grade. So there's not a lot of crossover. So having a
Mm-hmm.
larger class really is a healthy social dynamic because there's
Mm-hmm.
just a lot more opportunity for different friend groups and things to shift.
Yeah.
There's also this idea in our culture, in our educational culture, and also just in our parenting culture, we really are attentive to children's needs in
Mm-hmm.
a way that's um, unprecedented in
Mm-hmm.
history, and in some ways that can go a little to an extreme. And
Right.
so having a large class where there are many people's needs that have to be taken into consideration rather than
Mm-hmm.
just what I want and what I need,
Mm-hmm.
also creates a healthy social dynamic and an awareness of and a sense of the other too.
Yeah. One thing I know that public school teachers struggle with in these, they do have larger classroom sizes. I think my daughter's
Hmm.
class is 33, but they're
Hmm.
all on their school devices in the classroom when it comes to the technology. And the teacher has a really hard time managing that they're staying on task because
Oh
it's
yeah,
hard to lock down these devices. So I imagine just not having the kids have devices in the classroom, no matter the class size, is just helpful for the teacher to keep them focused.
right. I wouldn't even know
um,
where to begin, actually. Yeah.
I know. And yeah, and I've toured a Waldorf school and have seen the high schoolers who have their laptops and actually asked one of the 10th or 11th graders about it. And she said, when it's open, the teacher's usually behind us checking things and and they're more responsible at that age in high school to be doing
Right,
what they're supposed to be doing. You can't really expect a 6, 7-year-old to not play that game rather than,
right.
reading their digital textbook, which is also gamified. But um, okay, let's move on a little here. So one question that's come to me a couple times is Waldorf similar to Montessori schools? Can you explain briefly the differences?
Yeah, with the disclaimer that I've never actually experienced a
Yeah.
Montessori education. Neither, none of my kids have attended. So
Okay.
it's really just from a philosophical framework.
Mm-hmm.
What's interesting about Montessori and Waldorf is that they came to fruition about the same time period.
Okay.
Marie Montessori and Rudolf Steiner were contemporaries, and they were really looking at education from a completely different and new vantage point. So they were very innovative for
Mm.
their times, and they continue to be really influential throughout the
Mm-hmm.
world.
Yeah.
One of the differences between Waldorf and Montessori is just the general approach to the types of materials that they use and the method of the education.
Mm-hmm.
So in a Montessori school, my understanding is that the toys that they receive in early childhood, for example, really have a concept oriented with them,
Mm.
whereas the toys available for early childhood in Waldorf education are really open-ended. For example,
Mm.
a doll might just be just kind of the gesture of a head with maybe like a soft flowing body,
Mm-hmm.
with the intention that the child is using their imagination to fill in the rest of those details.
Mm-hmm.
And another example are just the quality, or the materials that are being used, the physical materials that are being used. And in a Waldorf education, we emphasize natural materials, so wooden blocks, lots of nature elements of nature in the classroom. The fibers are natural fibers, silk, linen, wool, um, and again, very limited detail in all of those
Yeah.
materials to enhance imagination. And then the storytelling aspect
Mm.
in early childhood, for example, is it's the same fairy tale day after day, and really working to develop this inner picture of
Mm-hmm.
the student, which then later on becomes their base, their foundation for academic instruction.
Mm-hmm.
In a Montessori school, my understanding is it's more child-centered, child-led.
Mm-hmm.
As far as their interest in activities, the teacher's job is to create different um, methods for them to explore that. And in
Okay.
a Waldorf school, it's everything is compulsory as a
Okay.
group. Everybody's doing the same thing at the same time.
Yeah.
Um, People often feel there's a sense of freedom in Waldorf education just because when you enter the campus, the students are they're very delightful. They're light. They have
Happy.
lots of
Yeah.
movement. They're
Yeah.
happy.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this idea that there's a lot of freedom, and actually,
Mm-hmm.
there's not a lot of freedom. There's a lot of
Mm.
rhythm that just holds them from an activity to the
Yeah.
next.
Yeah.
And it is definitely not student centered. It is definitely teacher led. The
Okay.
teacher definitely is the authority presenting the curriculum, and and that's how that works. Yeah.
Okay. This limited detail in the toys is very interesting to me. I'm reading a book
Hmm.
called Who's Raising the Kids by Susan Lin, and she
Hmm.
talks about how most toys that are, created to sell something else. So,
Yeah.
Elmos or Mickey Mouse's, that kind of stuff. Like they're created to sell a movie that's being or a TV show. And so when your kid is playing with an Elmo doll, you already know the kid knows what Elmo sounds like, what it looks like, where he lives, who his friends are. You can't create any type of world around Elmo
Yeah.
that's from your imagination. So giving them like something with less form and less recognizability is a really interesting way to let your child be creative. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, and and that used to be kind of the hot topic in Waldorf education
Mm,
before the advent of mobile screens and
yeah.
easily accessible like video gaming devices. So I'd say like in the mid-century, 60s,
Hmm.
1970s, 80s.
Hmm.
It really was if you're letting your child watch Sleeping Beauty, for example, there is a very fixed image now of who Sleeping Beauty is, what she looks like, what the dwarves look like, all of those things. Whereas
Hmm.
if you're listening to that fairy tale without that imagery already given
Hmm.
to you,
Yeah.
there's all kinds of interpretation of skin color or relationships,
Hmm.
just physical appearances. And in
Yeah.
many ways, a child will recreate the image of themselves. And
Mm.
really, on an archetypal level, fairy tales, we are every character in a fairy tale. And so a
Mm.
fairy tale offers a child an opportunity to view the world or experience the world through all these different perspectives,
Yeah.
which again leads to that flexibility in thinking and awareness of others.
Yeah.
Just a, yeah.
That's beautiful. Okay. And we didn't touch on phones. So you guys, I've learned at the Waldorf School, you collect the smartphones at the front office if they do have it. So they're just not allowed on the campus for the students.
Yes, yeah, we've arrived to that over time.
Yeah.
And I would say not a straight shot. That wasn't just like an initial thing. When I
Yeah.
was first teaching in middle school, it was 2016, 17, and maybe a handful of my 28 students had a phone. And so that wasn't an issue.
Hmm.
4 years later,
Hmm.
I would say, probably close to 75% of my class had cell phones. So in a very short period of time, there was a huge shift in the culture,
Hmm.
and yeah, we adapted.
Good. Okay, good.
Adapted quickly.
And I think, most, all public schools are struggling with that and letting the
Hmm.
kids have it in their hands, and they're trying to implement phone bans. But it
Hmm.
can be difficult. The difficulty comes in that from the parent pressures.
Yes.
The parents want the children to have the phones on them for safety, to keep tabs on them, that kind of thing. So do you have to just get parent buy-in, like when they register, this is what our plan is, and you kind of have to be on board?
Yeah, it's a mixture, and it really
Okay.
depends on when a family enters the school. So
Hmm.
because we spend so much time in that parent education realm, or just having those conversations in the early years. By the
Yeah.
time a group of parents is in a class where they're going to spend, 8 to 12 years together, there's a culture in that parenting group and some values that are formed early on. And that can sometimes carry that group of families through 12 years. And sometimes it starts to fracture, especially when the peer pressure of students, they're on a soccer team and all of their friends have a phone and, or, whatever they're outside of Waldorf experiences, those pressures start to come in. And or families who come in later in the journey and they've already made those choices, and so now you're restricting or taking away from your child. So those are ongoing conversations, but in general, our school culture is one where that's a value of the majority of parents. They've sought us out for those reasons, or they recognize that there's really something different qualitatively about our students and their capacity to hold conversations and to make eye contact and to feel comfortable in their skin. And then when they learn that there's actually a relationship between that and having a device in your hand all the time, there's some easier buy-in.
Yeah. Okay. And so let's touch on that too. When it comes to these kids having devices in their hands, it's really hampering their mental health state. So most teen girls in the US are feeling persistently sad or hopeless. 30% of teen girls high school age have seriously considered suicide. So there's the mental health state of children these days is not good. And we know that excessive tech use is linked to a decline in mental health. So what are you generally seeing, if you can share, in mental health trends for students of these ages in the Waldorf education system?
Yeah, we don't have the same kind of data that the broader education movement is. So it's very anecdotal, just my own experience. I can say, having taught in middle school back to back, so I taught 1 through 8. I had a sabbatical, and then I went right back into middle school and taught 6 through 8.
Yeah.
So I was in this middle school world for about 7 years, and just in that 7 years, there definitely was a difference of the amount of students who had smartphones, but also just in mental health and anxiety. And anxiety is where I would really focus my attention. I've been reading The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt.
Good.
Yeah, such a fantastic book.
Yes.
And I feel like it's a handbook for Waldorf parents. Like it's just a good parenting handbook. Yeah. Definitely aligns with how we approach things. But so anecdotally, what I experienced is just a much higher degree of anxiety, self-harm, negative talk, as specifically social media became more prevalent and available. We do have students who join in our high school who have been in different educational settings that were so intense in their kind of academic tracking and expectations, and they were not thriving in that environment. And so in some ways, our high school can be a little bit of a reprieve, or because the focus is across more than just one metric of success. There's a capacity to let those anxieties down. But I definitely see an increase, just even also in a Waldorf setting where access to technology is often delayed. But it doesn't seem like it is on the same scale as what the rest of education is experiencing.
Right. Okay. And I think a lot of it is the mindfulness stuff. I mean, I talked to a neuroscientist a few months ago, and he talked about if we just introduce like 5 minutes of meditation, even in kindergarten for these kids, and you guys just have such a focus on, being with yourself and having those mindfulness and movement exercises and prepping for the day, like instead of just sitting down and the teacher being like, put away your phones, we're getting started. Like that's how it is in these public school systems. Okay. So can you share any insight? I get some questions about like, okay, is restricting technology through high school going to allow them to be behind in any way as they move into adulthood and college education? So can you speak to that?
Yeah. So I have 4 adult children. My youngest is a senior and the oldest is 23. So they're definitely in that realm of transitioning. And the short answer is no.
Yeah.
Technology changes so fast.
Right.
And and it's built to be intuitive.
Right.
And I think the difference, though, is their relationship to technology. So
Mm,
what I do notice about my children and their relationship to technology, if they don't know something, they absolutely know how to figure something out. And that's a direct reflection of the method of the education that they received. We're
mm,
teaching, we're teaching you how to fish. We're not
mm,
going to continue just giving you fish. So
mm,
they really do have the confidence. And I
mhm,
think that is really what it comes from, this kind of inner confidence that they've been exposed to so many different topics, from
mm,
artistic to science to math, and everything's compulsory. Things that they didn't think they could do that they do, that
mhm.
they develop this inner confidence and this feeling like I can figure it out.
Yeah.
Even if I don't know, I know I can figure it out.
Mhm,
That's one piece. And the other piece is their social skills are really strong. They really have been brought up in relationship with their teachers. And so
mhm,
being able to ask for support and ask questions is second nature. It's not something that's shameful. They're
mhm,
not concerned about being ridiculed for not knowing something.
mhm.
So those relational skills are helpful.
Yeah.
So that part's easy. I do want to tie to, there does seem to be a stronger awareness of how I'm impacted by my technology.
Mhm.
Um, to the point where I see, many adults don't have that awareness,
Yeah.
and there's like a pause. There's like something doesn't feel congruent. There's something not right.
Mhm.
And being able to put up their own limits is
Right.
been inspiring, even for me.
Wow. And so, how did you manage, if you don't mind sharing, their
Mhm.
social media access and use within your home?
Yeah. I didn't.
Okay.
That was definitely a learning journey.
Mhm.
All of my kids were, well, so we're a blended family, and we had two different relationships to technology when our kids all came together. And
Mhm.
they were between the ages of 9 and 12 at that, 13 at that time.
Okay.
And two of them had, due to the circumstances of their family, had already, had iPads or even maybe a cell phone.
Mhm.
They didn't have access to social media at that time. And then the other two didn't receive a phone until they went into high school at the end of eighth grade.
Mhm.
It was still on the front curve of
Yeah.
social media.
Yeah.
And it just wasn't available in the way that it is today. It wasn't as ubiquitous. So
Mhm.
as a parent, that's definitely something I reflect on. Like what a kind of naive expectation that I'm going to hand something to my child and
Mhm.
expect that there were no training wheels.
Right.
Um, and as a teacher, it is even more embarrassing because I've definitely seen the impacts of that.
Mm.
So my advice now when I'm talking to parents in class is to really approach it like you would giving a child keys behind a car. Like, we don't just stick a kid in a seat and give them the keys and say, okay, good luck.
Right.
I hope you make it
Mhm.
to your destination, right? There are
Mhm.
all of these scaffolded checkpoints.
Yeah.
And one of them is really being educated about the impacts of technology and the motivation
Mhm.
behind social media in particular, and all of those things. So,
I like the motivation comment too, because it's like, what purpose does it serve for you? And what are you
right.
using it for? And if it's
Hmm.
just self serving and trying to boost your ego for how many
Hmm.
followers and likes you have, then it's not something you need to integrate into your
Right.
child's life. Um, and, you know, I don't think you were naive. I just think every single parent in the entire country was handing their kids phones. So it was such
Yeah.
an amazing tool, and we could keep track of them, and they could
Hmm.
let us know when, we need to pick them up, or coordinating and all those positive benefits. And we didn't realize the addictive nature that was
Hmm.
developing over time when it comes to those technology companies. And it's much more apparent now, and the research and the
Hmm.
stories and the data and the reports, everything's much more clear now. And we're hoping that real legislation will pass to protect our kids online, because we've gotten a little too far with addicting and harming
Yeah.
them.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you for sharing that personal experience. And
Yeah. You're welcome.
do you have any tips for parents regarding technology use, or speaking up with their public schools about what they kind of want? For example, like, I believe that a group of parents can really give schools now a reasonable explanation as to why you would want maybe a phone-free school or to opt out of screen use in certain subjects. So do you have any tips for parents around that?
Well, not being very familiar with how change manifests, but I
Yeah.
definitely think a group of aligned parents really
Mhm.
are a strong voice, and there are pathways. And in fact, in some ways, I feel like the public education system has more delineated pathways through the school boards and who you're electing. And there's also a sense of responsibility that, and accountability that
Mhm.
is expected of schools. And it can be more difficult because change is just really hard in the public education system because there are so many different layers and that legislation that's coming
Mhm.
top down. So it can be really hard. I think my strongest advice would be to find a group of like-minded parents and support one another in
Mhm.
helping create helping create your own,
Yeah.
your own value system. And I think as that builds and becomes more pervasive, that will
Mhm.
be a stronger lobbying body. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. There's a new group called Mothers Against Media Addiction. I have an interview with a couple of their team members, MAMA for short, and they're
Uh-huh.
really helping people to find like-minded individuals in their communities and have these discussions and give them tools to go to their schools to have these conversations. So I'll link to that in the episode notes. But
Yeah.
this was so interesting and informational, Brooke. Is there anything else we didn't cover on the Waldorf education that you feel is important for parents to know?
I think it's important to just go visit different types of schools.
Yeah.
There are good teachers in all education, and seeking those out, I think, are what's most important because
Mhm.
everything's not accessible to everybody, depending on your geography, your financial situation. So visit, ask questions,
Mhm.
find the good teachers. Yeah.
Yeah, and there are good teachers. I've spoken with now dozens of teachers at all different schools and lots of public schools, and they
Hmm.
are struggling and they're on the
Hmm.
same team as us. They
Yes.
want your kids focused and they want them happy and they want them engaged. And so you guys, like when you're finding like-minded parents, find like-minded teachers as well,
Yes,
right?
exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, Brooke, for this conversation. I've learned a lot from you. I hope parents are inspired to just open up lines of communication with their schools, visit different styles of schools, talk to other parents about their experiences, and to consider what might be best for their own children and know that we as parents have a say when it comes to our children's education system and their use of technology. So thank you again, Brooke.
Yeah, you're very welcome.